So, scope on a stick, the ultimate open platform. Here you see do-it-yourself two-photon scopes designed and made in labs at Yale, Calgary, and that one is in Oxford, I believe. The Calgary design was published as Rosenegger et al. In 2014, sort of the default standard as far as, from our point of view, do-it-yourself two-photon. But such designs have existed for many years, as we saw downstairs this morning, developed both as teaching tools in courses at Cold Spring Harbor, in Pike Lake, Romania, and other locations, but also used in research in labs like Spencer Smith, Florian Ingart, David Kleinfeld, Florian Albino, and others. Sutter, Thor Labs, Newport, Hamamatsu, Cambridge Technologies, and Vidrio were all involved in the truly open designs, supplying PMTs, scanners, focus drives, optics, mechanics, electrical control, and software. So what are the main reasons for the existence of do-it-yourself open platforms? I was going to ask for the people to know. Cost. This is usually almost the main reason given as you go down this path. Next, the ability to change the design as needs and technology change, and I think that was pretty obvious from our tour this morning. Again, use of components from different manufacturers gets you the best of all worlds. And sometimes the newest technologies and features are not yet available in commercial scopes. In fact, probably most people in this room would say they never. These are scopes on a stick designed by Sutter, manufactured by Sutter, for several labs in the past. We loosely followed the classic do-it-yourself designs, adding additional features such as, such as like tri-knock heads, which I don't think were on any of the scopes downstairs we saw. These large moving stages, which are similar to the things that were on Spencer's scopes downstairs. And as he pointed out on one of his scopes, resonance scan boxes, scope on the right has one of our so-called generic resonance scan boxes on the top. Sort of previous to that, most of the do-it-yourself scopes were all Gallo scanners, which is what's shown here.
What? So the one in the middle, why is that beam path so long?
Pardon?
It seems like an unusually long path from the scanner to the
Yeah, the main reason is that a lot of a do-it-yourself scope, you grab any scan lens and tube lens you can find, and to get a big enough beam expansion, you've got a lot of height. So yeah, that one's so big it doesn't even fit on the slide. Since the original two-photon patent in 1991, scopes like these were the main open two-photon platforms. Currently, there's many commercial multi-photon scope designs, only some of which are open. And why don't we take a quick look at some of the various multi-photon scopes available today? But first, let's consider what things might make scopes qualify as open. And as you can see from these, first of all, you've got to have an extrusion. Preferably silver, and the taller the better. It allows you to add components and make the necessary changes in component spacing easily. And again, the one in the middle, the extrusion is so tall it doesn't fit on the slide. They're usually modular, and that's not necessarily by design, but again, because of the need for optical space between the various components. So I think in this case, the tube lens is in this middle component, and the scan lens is up here by the scanners. It helps if design details are available on the modular components to enable easy expansion on the original designs. Typically, they have two colors only, silver and black. Newport, Linos, and Thorlabs extrusions are almost always silver. And as we know, Thorlabs parts are black. So let's look at some of the commercial scope platforms. This is the Zeiss IQ examiner. It's not really very open, as you can see, and it has very little black and no silver, and it doesn't have an extrusion at all. This is the Nikon AR1 on an FN1 stand. It does have an extrusion, this little guy over here. And it's got a black stand. But one thing you should really notice is the huge monolithic scan box up here at the top. And in fact, the extrusion is probably mainly just there to hold the scan box up on the top. So this is the Olympus flow viewer upright. Obviously, it's now black. It's very black. It looks more modular than the other two major scopes. This scope was pretty much non-black a few years ago, so that I think that kind of proves my point that they're trying to make a more modular scope. It's got lots of small, if they're not extrusions, at least sticks that hold the scope up. And kind of looking here, the sort of standard frame of an upright microscope is not in there anymore. It looks like the scan box is a little less monolithic. There's even a seam in the middle. So moving now, I think we're moving in the direction of slightly more open designs. This is the Prairie Bruker Ultima 2P. Curiously, in earlier models, the Ultima scope did have extrusions holding the top part on the bottom and supporting the scan box. Since the acquisition by Bruker, though, it seems like the Ultima seems to be moving more in the direction of a more traditional scope. This is very elegant. There's a very elegant, but probably non-adjustable column in here in the middle. Scientifica hyperscope. Not unlike Prairie Bruker, it has that sort of inside column here, but not probably much adjustment. Scientifica does make some of their components available as modules to incorporate into other designs. Now we're really moving to parts we know that are can be built into other things. This is the Thorlabs Bergamo, and some of you may realize this whole scope rotates. Oops, I can't do that. Back and forth about the focus of the lens, the objective. There's lots of extrusions here. This main one that the scope goes up and down on. One over here to hold the articulating beam path. And even though this is Thorlabs, it's actually not all that modular when you look at the parts in the middle of the scope. The main part of the scope, they're not the standard modular Thorlabs parts you're familiar with. The optical building blocks, so it's called. And this articulated arm brings the laser up into the scope as the scope tilts. And one thing that does is it means all this stuff in the middle here has to be pretty much in the location it's in, so it really can't be made into other kinds of designs. Thor does have simpler scopes that are more amenable to modular and open design. And this is Neurolabware. And actually, some of these scopes, the scope looks similar to some of the scopes Spencer had downstairs, I think with good reason. It's very silver, it's very black. It's got not one, but I think three extrusions back there. And looks like loosening this arm, you can adjust the body of the scope up and down. So it's just becoming much more modular and open. The enclosed beam path in this head end of the scope is very valuable. It keeps stray light out, which is really important for imaging signal to noise ratio, and more critically for keeping photostimulation light and video stimuli shown to behaving animals out of the imaging path. Unfortunately, that also makes this part of the scope less amenable to adaptation and change. So there's kind of trade-offs as you go from being a very modular scope, open design, to being a scope that some of the commercial designs. So you probably realized I was headed here. This is the Sutter MOM, or Moveable Objective Microscope. There's one nice tall extrusion here. The scope body can be placed at almost any height on this stick. The wide field conventional fluorescence microscope has been retained in this scope for people who don't want to leave the traditional scope behind. But that, you don't necessarily need that. Many people buy the scope either without the tri-knock head or without even the wide field fluorescence. The footprint down here is 6 inches square. There's all kinds of room for animals and stereotacs and for manipulators. The main extrusion really does nothing in this scope other than hold up the rest of the scope. And the scope mounts with 2 clamps to this extrusion. So you can, if you want a larger specimen or an animal on a trackball, you can buy a larger extrusion and mount the whole scope taller. You need to either do something different than the periscope tube or get a longer periscope tube. And if I can.
Will you be able to comment on the difference between the mom design and the first model that you showed that was like on a rail? And like, you know, for the newbie coming into the field and seeking to acquire a microscope, even myself, like I would not be able to really tell like what can I get with the mom that I can't get with the rail mounted or like vertically stacked devices you presented first? And when would you recommend one versus the other?
Yeah, well, so in sort of a conventional, you mean one of the conventional frame scopes where the components, as many people know, they're usually built up, so each one comes separate. You can use, sometimes you have an attachment in the middle for fluorescence, sometimes you don't. The space between the objective lens and back aperture and the tube lens usually has to be within a certain range to get reasonable optics out of that scope. So even if you were to separate those parts, first of all, you need some other structure to hold them up. And second of all, you change that distance, which is done in some of the more modular scopes. Some of the mom designs we've seen do that. But just basically, if you're going to buy a scope like that to start with, you need to be thinking down the road as you're going to do things to it, perhaps add something in, that those parts are going to be different lengths than they were to begin with, and they're going to need support because their support is kind of built into the integral framework of the scope.
Yeah, can I elaborate on that?
Sure.
I mean, not to sell the products or whatever, but the other thing is the ergonomics, right? So that the objective here, you can rotate that all the way around.
Oh, I
whereas
see.
those ones on a stick, they were a rigid configuration.
How about that one?
Yeah. So, and I didn't mention this before, but so Rick is part of the advisory committee for this project as well, and this NSF project, of which this workshop was a part, dissemination is a big part of it. And I wanted Rick on board because I think more than any other manufacturer, Sutter's put out just dead simple, fast, 0 to image time system. So they align everything. It's already a pretty elegant design. So you're working from stuff that Winfried Ding put together, right? With the initial design, you've made changes since then. But it's very compact, it's very elegant, it's very ergonomic, you move things around. Optical performance is basically the same as what you're gonna get with any other. It's not, in my opinion, it's not optimized for any particular like resolution or sensitivity or anything. It's basically what you get with the others. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems in that same ballpark. But it's all aligned to the factory and stuff, so you get it. You're not sitting there bolting parts together. I mean, we got a couple of these when we were in London. I think one of them, Benjamin Judakowitz, who's a professor now in Berlin, I think we were getting images like an hour after like breaking the seal in the first box. I mean, it was, you just take stuff out, get it on the table, and steer the beam into the periscope. And
the point you were making this morning about built aligned versus alignable, and I think we've spent a lot, and actually it was in the original design from Winfried Ding, making parts that basically you are forced to assemble it. If you understand the way it's supposed to be assembled, you hold something justified against the other part before you tighten the screws up, and that's not always possible when you're basically building up your own design on an extrusion. So that's there. mirrors in cases where they're very critical are glued in place based on a 45-degree surface that positions the mirror correctly.
Which I think is a dicey thing to do, but in practice it works. Yeah.
So there's no risk of drift over time. I mean, if you had drift over time, obviously
Yes.
you'd then be in a bit of a fix, but
Yeah.
then presumably you know how much that would be.
Yeah, and in terms of
Yeah.
things like glued mirrors, there's no
Yeah.
evidence that
Yeah.
there's any drift
No,
involved.
I can point one, like when a lot of students and lab members have access to this gentleman over there, the lever system to move the objective in
Mhm.
place creates a little vibration that really are hard on the mirror that you have at the bottom. So in practice, in the setup I've seen in mine,
Yeah.
we actually remove that mirror and we put a mirror bolted to the table
Mhm.
that, should you put the system out of place, just shoots the light like up
Yeah, so
towards the system.
basically you put
I put a 45-degree
a
mirror,
mirror on the table,
On the
here,
table.
right underneath. Yeah.
and that solves all our problems.
Yeah, it is one of the weaker points of that. The reason why that exists that way is if you set everything up and bring the beam directly in at a horizontal and orthogonal to the table, to the back of that. So there's a 45-degree mounted mirror in this area. The scanners are actually built on a bearings ramp, and you can move the scanners forward and back away from the scan lens and into the focus of the scan lens by moving the scanners and the periscope on that bearing rail. Originally that was done with the idea that that would be a motorized movement and it could compensate for differences in the front half of the scope where the tube lens and the objective change distance as the scope either focuses or moves the objective in X, Y, and Z. It's actually going to, if I could get it open without causing everything to crash.
Actually, another great thing about this, if I can chip in, is the fact that the only thing that moves at the object is the objective.
Mhm.
So if you want to add stuff on the path, like if you want to put a cube and have something else coming into the path of the
Yeah.
light, you have to think just about one entry point.
I get your point, and you're right. In practice, it's all pretty tight in this particular design, so you can fit things in, but it's so compact that the trade-off is there's not a lot of extra space to put stuff in there.
That's what allowed us to do
This
with
video highlights the whole beam path.
Already shown.
The Southern Instruments
Yeah.
Three-Photon Movable Objective Microscope.
Shut this down.
Please note that the table optics shown.
Just wanted to show you a little bit, this just gives you the, oops, I'm not
I
sure.
think you have to move it over to the other screen, or
Maybe I can't do that. I'll bring a different. That's where the mirror that sits that normally moves between the two photon and wide field parts of the scope. So here it's been uncovered, the cover's taken off. There's a little servo motor that moves this mirror block into and out of the image. And when it's out in the image, the beam path is going over to the left-hand side of the scope, which is the wide field. When it's out of the beam path, you're getting the two-photon, the Ayer laser coming from the back. So what we've done initially for labs at Berkeley, added a beam combining cube, or actually it's a polarizing beam splitter used as a beam combining cube in that area. And actually, while it's not in place in this scope, this same mirror moving assembly can still be in there and moving the mirror in and out of the way. So this is something, a way we were able to expand the capabilities of the scope by putting that in there.
So about that one, something that is like, unfortunate, but it's not like we have many degrees of freedom, is that this beam splitter is dangerously close to the focal plane of the scan lens,
Mm-hmm.
which makes for merging, for instance, like 3D holography, difficult when you defocus, and sometimes you end up hitting the cube. So we typically have a spare cube and hope for the best, but
Okay.
once in a while
Okay.
we've been punching holes in it.
Yeah, so what you were talking about earlier about Or actually, that was,
Yeah.
having the.
Yeah, we had to specifically design so that we would come to a focus.
Yeah, no, I mean, ideally, like, I would have loved to have this thing just before the scan lines, for instance, or
Yeah,
even
well,
way
so-
closer to the scan lines if possible.
Well, so there, I didn't bring there's a way to put a dichroic in here, which it actually existed in the very initial papers about what's called the retinoscope, which was
Mhm.
the publication of this. They used dichroics in there. It would be a little difficult to put a polarizing beam splitter there. It's a little bit, not quite enough space unless you went to a longer focus scan. But yeah, those kinds of things probably could be done. The other thing that is true, the scanning system and the scanner mount have multiple mounts in the scope. So you can move the whole scanner path back and move the scan lens mount forward and back too. So one of the more significant open platform scope, which incorporates the moving objective of the MOM design, is MIMS, introduced by Genelia Farms about 10 years ago. And here's the poster where they presented that. MIMS stands for Modular In Vivo Multi-Photon Microscopy System and was developed by Carl Svoboda and colleagues. MIMS uses at its core the Sutter XYZ stage. It's right in here. Up in here. And it's blown up here on this slide. So this is just our exact same core in the scope. And this noisy thing they have over here is they're what they call well, it's the detector path they designed, which these are all shown in actual parts over here. There's the core. And we've been using this detector path both on MIMS scopes that we build, but it also works perfectly fine on standard MOMs. So again, we've had a modular, several different kinds of detector paths that we've offered with the MOM. And this is one of them, which was designed by another group. And that happens to be one of the first commercial 2-inch optics detector paths. So this is a complete MIMS type MOM. The optical breadboard up here is at the level of the scanners and scan lens. And that means it's available for, you can combine multiple scan paths at that level and add other devices such as DMD projection for pattern photostimulation, or again, an attachment for wide field microscopy, usually just as sort of a camera mount. But 3 separate beam paths can easily be combined there. The whole table is mounted on bearing rails that run forward to back along the table, so that the head of the scope and the whole scope, in fact, can be moved out of the way, and you can put an animal down and then bring the scope forward for imaging. And the standard MOM has such a feature as well, but it doesn't allow for as easy combination of multiple beam paths. And again, like the horizontal MOM, the front of the scope can be tilted fully 90 degrees in either direction. So here's one possible combination of all the configuration of the MIMS scope at the Turner Lab at Genelia Farms. And this particular one has a DMD projector over here on the left-hand side. When you come in at an angle, you can see here's the electronics, and the projector is up in here, and then it's relayed into the scope on that side. This is a MIMS scope that we built at Sutter and was sold and installed at NIH. The feature we added here that's unique to this particular MIMS, the ones that we built, is to put the whole wide field path over here on this side. Not just, it's got a Trinarc head and this vertical Luminator from Olympus. Our standard MOMs all have that capability, but the MIMS is originally built, just offered just a simple camera mount and a place to bring in illumination on the table. And it was easy to add that to this because of the openness of the MIMS design. In the right panels. You can see from the top, here's the wide field path. This particular scope has a resonance scanning path over here and a gallo-gallo scanning path over there. And if you zooming in a little here in the bottom path, you can see the dichroic and the two scan lenses that combine the two scanner paths. And then there's a mirror here that actually drops down out of the way to either allow, when it's up, attachment for the wide field path, or when it's down, allows the two photon beam to come forward. So here are two of the three Sutter-based platforms we've been talking about, and if you're paying attention, still listening. Yeah, we're going to talk briefly about three-photon microscopy. Both these open platforms have been used for three-photon imaging. Chris Hsu at Cornell University did some of the first, if not the first, three-photon imaging with a microscope modified from the standard open design standard model. And this is a picture of that scope. It may not be the first three-photon scope, but it's certainly the first three-photon model. So you can see if you look carefully, the extrusion back here, and then the horizontal slide from the MOM front to back.
Besides, changing the PMTs to match a certain wavelength and perhaps changing dichroic filters, has there been any significant modifications that we need to know about if you were to install a three-photon scope?
The scan lens and tube lens that were in the original MOM kind of taper off around just below 1300. Yeah.
So this is 1500 excitation.
So what they did in this particular case, I think they took out our scan lens and put in an aluminum tube.
Yep.
And put probably just a Thor. It sounded like from Chris that they just put a Thorlabs Acromat with longer transmission in there.
And the gallo mirrors by default are
silver rather than yeah. Most of our original. There was a period of time when just like everybody was saying, "Oh, I got to have." What's the transmission characteristics of your scan lens and tube lens? It was like nobody was going to buy our scope anymore because it didn't go out to 1700 nanometers. It was like, well, and then I finally came to the realization that I don't know what these people were thinking, but they weren't going to do three-photon imaging just by cranking up to a longer wavelength, the 1300 on their two-photon laser. I believe there was people who thought that was the case for a while.
Okay.
And until I started getting the full understanding of the fact that one had to use much more power in lower rate lasers in order to be able to do three-photon excitation.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot of education that needs to be out there. I mean, people thought that. I've had conversations with people who thought that we'd have to use heavy water rather than regular water or air for immersion. There's also a lot of misunderstandings about the laser technology. I've been in several places where they bought laser systems that they thought they could use for three-photon because it was an ultra-fast system, it was hitting the right wavelengths, but it's just, they're so fussy and so fickle that they're not really practically usable for a neuroscience experiment.
Yeah, at this point, I think.
Yeah, they are very much not at the same level as the Tisafari.
Yeah.
I noticed, so we've got a coherent Monaco, and so is Jack Waters still using that? Because I'd understood it was a different. So there's a few of these lasers which I think are in practice being used to get good data. I'm pleased to see that obviously that is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
We for another reason we got one, and we were actually doing some demos on it. The APE system, I think, is what people have recommended us. I think there's probably
And 8 being 8
APE
megahertz?
Sorry?
What is
No,
that?
that's a company. It's
Oh,
German.
yeah. So,
German company. And yeah, they're 2 megahertz rep rate or something.
okay.
Yeah.
It's not, so that laser company has been used by Scientific as far as I know.
Yeah, they're using.
Yeah.
I think there isn't,
There is a spectrophysics version. What's interesting,
Yeah. but I don't think anyone's used the spectrophysics for Three-Photon, have they?
well, yeah, I guess,
I mean, this kind of information is
Yeah.
actually,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, they have.
Been used,
Yep.
I mean, it's the
It has successfully been used for Three-Photon.
Spirit NOPA.
yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, they were trying to sell us one, but the question is anyone
Yeah,
successfully used that for
we do
Three-Photon?
it in my lab all the time.
Yeah?
This
Three-Photon,
box,
okay.
this box here, which is the optical parametric amplifier, is made by a single company for
Yeah.
both majors.
That's right.
That company is Light Conversion.
That's right. Ours finally works after a year.
Okay. And the other company, APE,
Yeah.
that you mentioned, they make both components themselves.
Yeah, so you can comment on this better than I can. I mean, the conversations I've had with people about laser sources for 3P, I mean, people have vastly different opinions about even the same product. Their experience has been different. Somebody gets a reliable one, somebody gets an unreliable one.
And as you
yeah.
said, it's still in that finicky stage, so
It's
the
not
experience is
stage,
going to
we gotta
vary.
be up for it, for dealing with that. And then the other thing that I think there needs to be more education on is that the pixel rate is, an order of magnitude lower.
Yeah,
And a lot of people don't realize that. They think they can still do their 512 by 512 and 30 hertz with 3P and 1.5 millimeters, and it's no problem.
You don't need resonance scanners
Yeah.
on a 3-photon scope
Yeah.
at
Are
this
they
point.
actually, is anyone actually doing resonance scanning? It's I know of one user, I think, who's doing it.
The rep rates are not really high enough
Yeah.
to support it.
Yeah.
You won't be getting a single
Yeah.
event per pixel. So I'm not sure if it's this laser was either 1 or 2 megahertz, and they either now have or about to get 4
Yeah.
megahertz, and they're hoping they can maybe do a little resonance scanning. The scope at this point has been galvanized.
Is there anyone doing random access 3-photon? That sounds very low.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I mean, only that paper from Chris Schuer, who did do the paper, right?
Yeah, well, I guess they had gobbles, but not with AOD.
Oh, not with AOD.
Yeah.
Random access.
AOD. AOD bro.
Yeah.
Other points, other questions? Thank you, everybody. Spencer and Ryan and others here. Thanks for the technical people who got me, I guess actually Nico finally got me. People, et cetera, who work on the ball. So thank you very much. Yes.
Is there any plan to make these microscopes light tight?
Well, so not being complete, I mean, one of the reasons why, let's see, it's open because it was designed that way. And I actually didn't realize the fact that making it closed, yes, clearly has an advantage, but it makes it less useful for other things. But yes, we're working on that. The simplest thing is one can make basically just a box that goes, Dan Dombeck has a design that he's used. And I've at least suggested the same thing to other people. I mean, you can practically print it, 3D print it. So.
Yeah.
It's still, one of the things that I don't know that we have good idea on or not yet, but there's clearly, the objective is made to gather photons. So no matter how much you make the part where photons aren't supposed to get in, there's always going to be photons getting into the objective. But clearly it's a lot less.
I mean, they were putting like a balloon.
The
Balloon, right? There was a
around,
balloon
yeah.
on the top of it, so they were
But
holding away.
the tip is still going to be
Yeah.
somewhat exposed. I was wondering whether you could get, I was more thinking in terms of if the animal's getting light, especially if it's in some sort of visual stimulus paradigm, is there enough light that gets through the head so the photomultiplier tubes pick it up? Probably some, I don't know. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
you can see that. I've seen that before. Yeah, depending on where you're imaging the brain and how bright your visual stimulus is, light can go through the eye, through the brain, and get to the ENT.
So Nico was saying this morning, if you hold the flashlight on the back of your hand, you can see where light coming through.
Kind of. So tell me about your spiritual advisors. Are these,
Ali, probably some of you have talked to, he's the manipulator. He and I drive to work together.
Okay.
So
Okay.
he usually gets to hear whatever emails I've looked at before I had breakfast.
Can manipulate the guy.
Barbara Grady's my buddy. And Shin's actually IT at Center, so.
All right, they're sitting out. We'll wait.
I got done too soon. Wasn't expecting it.
So it looked like, so when you were talking about, you changed the design of the tube lens, like the
Mhm.
size to fit the new Thorlabs version, right?
Mhm.
So did you also change the distance that it's?
Yeah, yeah. So the scan lens mount, which doesn't show too well in this picture, can be put in a couple of different locations. And as I said before, the scanners move on a bearing rail, but that bearing rail actually can be put in a nearer and closer location. So it would be more difficult to get things tighter together, but you can get additional length between all the components on that rail.
So I mean, because if you have to change those distances, doesn't that make it
Well,
a challenge to be able to do like 2 and
Oh.
3 with one instrument? So
Well, I'm not saying, how to say this? They're not changed to get them to fit in there. It's changed to accommodate the different focal lengths of the
oh,
objects.
okay.
now, there's an interesting trade-off, and you might be able to comment on that, but like, in designing the Galvo and scanless assembly, you have two constraints. You need to cover the field of view,
Mhm.
and you need to fill up the back aperture of the objective to make a diffraction spot that's like small.
Mhm.
But you have the ability to, for instance, pick a longer scan lens and bigger galvos running at a smaller angle range,
Mhm.
or a shorter scan lens with smaller galvos that then have to cover a wider range of angles. What would motivate this option versus another one? Like, if you know, is there anything that we're not thinking about when? Why don't I put big galvos and have a demagnification that's greater that would allow me to have more space between my elements, for instance?
Well, so the first reason you don't have bigger galvos is because they don't move as fast.
Fair enough. Yeah. No more questions.
But, so, one of the things in order to get the beam to overfill the back aperture of the Nikon 16x objective, which at least at that time was the biggest, probably still is other than the things we've seen downstairs, the biggest back aperture objectives. In this scope, we were able to get Nikon strangely had a different tube lens that was, let's see, make sure I get this right, longer focal length, so we could go from, the normal scope had about a 4x beam expansion in the scope with, for example, resonant scanners with 5mm mirrors. That means 20 millimeter back apertures, the large in film. That's right on the edge of being big enough for that objective. So we went to this longer focal length tube lens, but for some reason nobody thought about the optical fact that that's going to mean a smaller field of view. So we went that way, and actually that was all the people at Allen who actually probably, they wanted to use that objective, and they said let's go with this other tube lens, and we went with it. But all those scopes have a slightly smaller field of view because. But yeah, there's almost everything are trade-offs in this business of covering something versus uncovering it, and bigger field of view, bigger depth.
Yeah, there's a ton of engineering trade-offs, and it's difficult to get people to understand how they all interact.
Right. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why a scope like the first few I showed that are trying to be the scope for everybody, not just in your lab, but in the lab there and the lab next door, because they're so exorbitantly expensive that they can only be in core facilities, or hardly ever going to be
Yeah.
do the one thing you want to do very well.
Okay. Well, next thing we'll do, we're gonna eat some coffee, chat for a little bit, and then we'll have some demos. So thanks again.